barley bread, date wine, and roasted lamb, measured, recorded, and delivered twice daily to beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. Clay tablets excavated from Mesopotamian temples don't describe these gods in abstract theological terms. They document what they ate for breakfast. Administrative records from 2400 BCE list specific cuts of meat, calculated portions of butter, vessel counts of beer, arranged by strength and quality. Temple accountants tracked divine groceries with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to human worker rations, creating meal records that survived 4 millennia in wedge-shaped script pressed into sun-baked clay. The Anunnaki required feeding. Welcome. It's late perhaps, wherever you are right now. The day behind you, tasks finished or abandoned, that particular quiet settling in when the mind finally has permission to wander. Thank you for being here, for choosing to spend this time exploring one of ancient history's most documented yet mysterious practices, the feeding of gods who walked among humans and apparently needed to eat. Because here's what makes these texts so remarkable. They're not myths or legends passed down through oral tradition. They're accounting ledgers, grocery lists, ration documents created by scribes, whose job was recording everything that flowed through temple economies. 3 sheep to Enlil on the 5th day of the month, 5 vessels of beer, strong variety, 2 measures of ghee, 1 portion of dates, counted. The specificity is relentless, creating archives that read more like restaurant supply orders than scripture. For over a century, scholars have debated what this documentation means. Mainstream archaeology interprets these texts as religious theatre, elaborate rituals where statues received symbolic offerings that sustained priestly hierarchies and redistributed agricultural wealth. The food was metaphor, they argue. Divine presence was spiritual abstraction. What mattered was the social and economic system, not literal divine digestion. But others have wondered differently. Zecharia Sitchin spent decades proposing that the Anunnaki were physical beings from beyond Earth, extraterrestrial visitors, whose biological needs were recorded with the same administrative thoroughness applied to human provisioning. Ancient astronaut theorists point to the extraordinary detail. Why would fiction require such exact accounting? And ask whether these texts document actual feeding of actual beings with actual appetites. We're not here tonight to settle that debate. We're here to read what the tablets actually say, to examine the evidence they preserve, to hold competing interpretations with equal curiosity, to explore what it meant when Sumerian civilization organized itself around feeding divine beings, dedicating vast resources to preparing meals for gods who dwelled in temple sanctums and received service as meticulous as any provided to human royalty, to wonder at a culture so committed to this practice that they documented every measure of grain, every cut of meat, every brewing batch across thousands of years. Take a breath. Where are you right now as you listen? Lying down, perhaps? Lights dimmed or darkness complete? Maybe night sounds drift through your walls. Or maybe you're wrapped in that urban quiet that isn't silence, but the distant hum of a world that never fully rests. Let your shoulders settle. Let weight sink into whatever surface holds you. You're exactly where you need to be. Before we continue, a small request. If you find value in this exploration, if these ancient questions resonate with you, consider leaving a like or subscribing. It helps others discover this content, helps us continue creating these journeys through deep time and forgotten worlds. Your support means more than algorithms can measure. Now then, picture a clay tablet, small enough to hold in 2 hands, wedge marks pressed in careful rows, each symbol formed by a reed stylus held at precise angles, pushed into wet clay with practiced pressure. The scribe worked in a temple courtyard in Uruk or Nippur, sometime around 2400 BCE, recording the day's offerings to Enlil or Inanna. 3 measures of barley flour, 2 sheep, unblemished, 5 vessels of beer, strong variety, 1 vessel, ordinary, butter, 1 portion, dates, counted and delivered. The Euphrates flowed brown with mountain silt. The sun blazed overhead. Somewhere in the temple's inner sanctum, a statue stood in perpetual twilight, waiting for its meal. The scribe pressed the final mark, set the tablet aside to harden, an accounting record. Proof of offerings made, cosmic order maintained through careful transaction between mortal and divine. 4,000 years pass. The tablet survives everything. Empires, languages, the hands that formed it, the temple walls that housed it, but the clay remembers. The wedges hold their shapes. Tonight, we're going to follow those records. We'll examine what the tablets reveal about divine appetites and temple kitchens, about the cosmology that made feeding gods not just sensible but necessary for survival. We'll present the competing interpretations, acknowledge what remains unknown, and stand in the ruins where these offerings once filled the air with the smell of bread and smoke. The questions waiting in cuneiform wedges have no simple answers, but they have details, measurements, patterns, specifics that open windows into a world where the boundary between mortal and divine was measured in portions of bread, vessels of beer, and smoke rising into Mesopotamian stars that still shine above us now, unchanged. Let's begin where the tablets begin, with clay and water and the patient work of hands that believed what they recorded mattered enough to preserve forever. Clay holds memory differently than stone. Stone resists, endures through its hardness, its refusal to yield, but clay accepts. It receives impressions, preserves the exact pressure of fingers, the angle of tools, the moment when a hand pressed meaning into wet earth. In ancient Mesopotamia, this receptivity became revolution. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, humans discovered that soft mud could be transformed into permanent record, not through strength but through transformation, sun-baked or kiln-fired into ceramic permanence that would outlast empires. The tablets we're examining tonight, the ones that detail what the Anunnaki consumed, weren't created as sacred literature. They emerged from administrative necessity. Temple complexes in Sumerian cities operated as economic centers, managing vast agricultural resources. Thousands of workers received rations, herds numbered in the tens of thousands, grain stores held harvests measured by the ton. Someone had to track it all, so they wrote it down. Every transaction, every allocation, every offering made to deities who dwelled in temple sanctums. Scribes trained for years to master cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script formed by pressing a cut reed stylus into clay at specific angles. The word cuneiform derives from Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. Each character was built from combinations of wedge impressions, vertical and horizontal and diagonal, creating a writing system of remarkable efficiency. A skilled scribe could produce dozens of tablets in a day, documenting grain distributions, livestock movements, textile production, and the meals prepared for gods. These weren't grand proclamations or mythological epics. They were receipts, inventories, daily accounting that no one expected would survive millennia. But clay tablets have a peculiar durability. When Mesopotamian cities burned, whether through conquest or accident, the fires that destroyed wooden structures and organic materials baked administrative tablets into indestructibility. Archives that might have crumbled if left unfired became ceramic records, preserved by the same violence that destroyed the civilizations that created them. Archaeologists excavating ruined cities found thousands upon thousands of tablets, often still organized on shelves or stored in ceramic jars, waiting to be read. The decipherment took generations. In the mid-19th century, scholars like Henry Rawlinson worked from multilingual inscriptions, particularly the Behistun relief in modern Iran, where Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian versions of the same text allowed comparison. Rawlinson risked his life making copies from the cliff face, hanging from ropes hundreds of feet above the ground to record the cuneiform signs. His work, combined with efforts by other scholars working on various inscribed materials, gradually unlocked the ability to read wedge marks that hadn't been understood for 2,000 years. The breakthrough transformed understanding of human history. Suddenly, Sumeria wasn't myth or biblical reference but documented reality, with dates, king lists, legal codes, and yes, meal records for deities. Consider what this preservation means. The Sumerians didn't intend to send messages across millennia. They were solving immediate problems, managing temple economies, fulfilling religious obligations. Yet their bureaucratic thoroughness created an archive more complete than any contemporary cultures. We know more about daily life in 3rd millennium Sumeria than we know about many periods 1,000 years closer to the present, because scribes recorded everything, and clay remembered. The tablets that detail Anunnaki meals come primarily from major temple complexes at sites like Nippur, Uruk, Ura, and Lagash. Dating from roughly 2600 to 2000 BCE, they describe offering schedules, specify quantities of grain and meat and beer, name the deities receiving each portion. The language is precise, technical, devoid of poetic elaboration. 3 measures of barley, 2 sheep, 5 vessels of beer. The tone resembles modern spreadsheets more than scripture. This specificity distinguishes these texts from mythological literature. When the Epic of Gilgamesh describes gods, it uses metaphor and symbolism. When temple accounting tablets describe offerings to those same gods, they use weights and measures. The contrast raises questions scholars continue debating. Were the Sumerians literal-minded, believing statues consumed physical food? Were they performing elaborate theatre, understanding the symbolic nature while maintaining economic structures? Or was something else occurring? Some framework of divine presence that doesn't map neatly onto modern categories of literal versus symbolic? The tablets don't answer that question. They simply state what was offered. They record the system's operation without explaining its underlying logic, like finding a restaurant's purchase orders without any accompanying explanation of why humans eat. The documents preserve practice without philosophy. Thousands of these administrative tablets survive, catalogued in museums worldwide. The British Museum holds extensive collections from 19th century excavations. The University of Pennsylvania Museum houses materials from Nippur. The Louvre, the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, the Iraq Museum all preserve fragments of this vast bureaucratic record. Scholars estimate that less than 1% of Mesopotamian tablets have been translated and published. The majority sit in storage, their contents unknown, waiting for Assyriologists with the training and funding to read them. What we know about Anunnaki meals comes from this small translated fraction. Even that limited sample reveals patterns, regularities, a system operating with consistency across centuries. The gods ate twice daily, morning and evening. Specific deities received specific portions. Seasonal festivals required special menus. Temple kitchens operated according to detailed protocols. Preparing offerings that fed priestly hierarchies after divine consumption was considered complete. The system's sophistication suggests deep roots, practices refined over generations, but those roots extend back into time, when writing didn't exist, when memory alone preserved tradition, before tablets, before cuneiform, before administrative archives made divine meals subject to accounting oversight. Something was already occurring. Some practice, some belief, some relationship between Sumerian humans and the beings they called Anunnaki. To understand that relationship, we need to go further back, before the tablets, before the temples where tablets were stored, before Sumeria itself emerged from scattered farming settlements into the world's first urban civilization. We need to trace the landscape that shaped these people, the environmental pressures and possibilities that created the conditions where feeding gods became not just practice but necessity, woven into the fabric of cosmic order itself. The Persian Gulf reached further inland once, its ancient shoreline lying perhaps 150 miles north of where waters lap today. Geological evidence traced through sediment cores reveals a coastline that shifted over millennia as sea levels fluctuated with glacial cycles. Around 8000 BCE, as the last ice age released its grip on Earth's climate, melting ice sheets raised ocean levels worldwide. The Gulf advanced slowly northward into what would become southern Iraq, flooding river valleys, creating extensive marshlands where fresh water met salt. The Tigris and Euphrates, younger rivers then in geological terms, carved channels through alluvial plains, depositing silt from highland sources thousands of miles distant. This was not desert, not yet. The region that would eventually be called Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, existed in a brief window of climate history when rainfall patterns favored agriculture. The Fertile Crescent earned its name from genuine fertility, a curved band of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean coast, where wild grasses grew thick and game animals migrated seasonally. Around 10,000 BCE, humans in this region began experimenting with cultivation, domesticating wild emmer wheat and barley, learning to plant and harvest rather than gather what grew without intervention. The transition took millennia. Villages appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared as techniques improved and populations grew. At Jericho in the Jordan Valley, at Chatal Huyuk in Anatolia, at dozens of sites across the Fertile Crescent, people learned to live in permanent settlements supported by stored grain. They developed pottery for storage, built houses from mud brick, buried their dead beneath floors. Society grew more complex, labor more specialized. Someone could focus on making tools while others grew food, because surplus grain provided security against immediate starvation. But in southern Mesopotamia, the landscape presented unique challenges. Rainfall was insufficient for reliable farming. Summer temperatures reached extremes that withered crops. The rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes destructively, sometimes not at all. Yet the soil, when watered, produced remarkable yields. Silt deposited annually by Tigris and Euphrates. Floods created rich agricultural potential, if, and only if, water could be controlled, channeled, distributed when needed, rather than when rivers dictated. Irrigation became necessity, small scale at first. Ditches dug to direct water from river channels to nearby fields. Over generations, the networks grew more elaborate. Canals extended miles from water sources. Levees contained flood surges. Reservoirs stored water for dry seasons. Managing these systems required coordination across multiple farming communities, agreements about water rights, labor obligations, maintenance schedules. Complexity bred organization. Organization created hierarchy. Imagine standing on that plain in 4500 BCE before cities existed. The horizon stretches flat and distant in every direction, broken only by the green corridors marking river courses. Reed beds grow thick near water, providing material for baskets, mats, building frames. Date palms cluster where groundwater allows, their fruit a crucial food source that stores well and provides concentrated calories. The air smells of river mud, vegetation, the occasional dust of wind crossing open ground. Night transforms the landscape. Without light pollution, stars blaze in patterns. People learn intimately through necessity. The moon's phases govern timing for planting and harvest. Venus appears and disappears on predictable schedules. Orion rises in winter. The Pleiades mark seasonal transitions. These aren't abstract astronomical phenomena, but practical guides. Celestial calendar, helping humans time their interventions in agricultural cycles. Perhaps communities gathered to watch these patterns, to discuss their meaning, to pass knowledge between generations. The stars were constant when so much remained uncertain. Floods came or didn't, crops thrived or failed, raiders attacked or passed by, but celestial cycles repeated with reliability that must have seemed divine in origin, evidence of order underlying apparent chaos. The people living in this landscape around 5000 BCE, in what archaeologists call the Ubaid period, were already sophisticated. They built substantial houses from mud brick, their walls plastered and sometimes decorated. They created elaborate pottery with distinctive geometric patterns. They organized labor for irrigation projects that transformed available agricultural land. Their villages showed signs of social differentiation, some structures larger and better furnished than others, suggesting wealth accumulation and status hierarchies. Yet they weren't fully Sumerian. That identity would emerge later, forged through the intensification of urban life, the development of writing, the crystallization of religious practices into forms we can recognize through textual evidence. The Ubaid people represent the foundation, the culture whose innovations in agriculture, architecture, and social organization made later developments possible. What did they believe about gods? Their graves contain figurines, abstract representations of human forms with emphasized eyes and geometric bodies. Clay figures found in temple foundations suggest ritual practices involving offerings and symbolic representations. But without writing, without texts explaining meaning or intent, interpretation remains speculative. We see evidence of practice without access to the thoughts behind those practices. The climate was shifting, gradually, toward drier conditions. Rainfall decreased incrementally across centuries. The Gulf's shoreline stabilized, then began its slow retreat southward, as sedimentation from rivers built land faster than sea levels rose. The marshlands that had characterized the region began drying at their margins. Agricultural success became more dependent on irrigation, less on rainfall supplementing river water. This environmental pressure may have accelerated social complexity. Communities that managed water most effectively prospered, those that couldn't face starvation or migration. Success required not just individual skill but collective coordination, leadership that could organize labor and adjudicate disputes. The stage was being set, through environmental necessity and human adaptation, for something unprecedented in human history. The world's first cities would rise in this landscape. Uruk would grow to house tens of thousands of people, its walls enclosing an area of 2 square miles. Temples would tower on artificial mountains called ziggurats, visible for miles across flat plains. Writing would be invented to manage the economic complexity of urban life, and at the center of these cities, in sanctuaries built from mud brick and plaster, statues of deities would receive daily meals prepared according to specifications that scribes would record on clay tablets. But that transformation remained centuries in the future. First came the slow accumulation of knowledge, the gradual intensification of settlement, the patient work of generations learning to thrive in a landscape that offered abundance only to those who could control its water. The stars continued their courses overhead, unchanged by human concerns, marking time in patterns that would eventually be recorded in astronomical texts of remarkable precision. The Sumerian word for god was Dingir, written in cuneiform as a star symbol, not metaphorically star-like, but literally represented by the sign for star, suggesting a connection between divine beings and celestial phenomena that permeated Sumerian cosmology. Yet the gods as understood in Sumerian thought weren't distant or abstract. They possessed personalities, preferences, familial relationships, and most importantly, physical presence in specific locations. A deity didn't exist as pure spirit, but dwelled in a particular temple, in a particular city, with a particular house requiring maintenance and offerings. This concept of divine embodiment shaped everything about Sumerian religious practice. Temples weren't gathering places for worshippers in the modern sense. They were literally houses for deities, structured like royal residences with courtyards, storage rooms, private chambers, and sanctums where the god's statue resided. The statue wasn't a representation of the deity, but the physical locus of divine presence, the form through which the god interacted with the material world. Archaeological evidence from temple excavations reveals the architecture supporting this cosmology. At Uruk, the White Temple, built around 3200 BCE, stood on a raised platform accessed by monumental stairs, its walls gleaming with white gypsum plaster visible for miles. Inside, a central chamber held the cult statue, positioned to face east toward the rising sun. Smaller rooms surrounded this sanctum, spaces for priests to prepare offerings, store ritual equipment, and conduct the daily service required to maintain divine favor. The temple as house meant the deity needed everything a living resident required: food, obviously, but also clothing, furniture, music, companionship. Texts describe elaborate ceremonies where statues were dressed in garments woven from finest wool, adorned with jewelry, anointed with precious oils. They were awakened at dawn, fed breakfast, allowed to rest during afternoon heat, fed again in evening, then settled for night. The statue's eyes were ritually opened each morning through the opening of the mouth ceremony, allowing the deity to see offerings presented and receive prayers offered. This wasn't symbolic theatre to Sumerian practitioners. The entire economic and political structure of their civilization rested on the reality of divine presence and the necessity of maintaining proper relationships with beings who controlled cosmic forces. When floods came or failed, when harvests thrived or withered, when cities prospered or suffered conquest, these outcomes reflected divine will responding to human action or inaction. Feeding the gods properly wasn't superstition, but pragmatic survival strategy. Consider what this implied about the nature of divinity. Modern monotheistic traditions often conceive of God as omnipotent, omniscient, requiring nothing from humans. The Sumerian pantheon worked differently. Gods possessed immense power but also vulnerabilities and needs. They grew hungry if not fed. They became angry if neglected. They could be pleased through offerings, flattered through praise, persuaded through prayer. The relationship was transactional, reciprocal, a cosmic economy where humans provided service and sustenance in exchange for divine favor, manifesting as agricultural abundance, military victory, social order. The Anunnaki fit into this pantheon as a collective designation for certain categories of deities. The term appears in various contexts across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian texts, its exact meaning shifting over time. Generally, it referred to the great gods associated with earth and underworld, distinguished from the Agigi, who were sometimes associated with heaven. In creation myths, particularly the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki appear as junior deities who labored to dig irrigation canals until they rebelled against the hard work, leading to the creation of humans as replacement workers. This narrative reveals something crucial about Sumerian cosmology. Humans weren't created for abstract spiritual purposes, but for specific physical labor. To take over tasks the gods found burdensome. We were meant to feed the gods, to maintain their temples, to perform the agricultural and manufacturing work that sustained divine households. In exchange, we received guidance, protection, and the order that made civilization possible. It was a contract, explicit and pragmatic. The question of whether Sumerians believed this literally or understood it symbolically may be the wrong question, imposing modern categories onto ancient thought. Perhaps for them, no clear distinction existed between material and spiritual, between physical and metaphorical. The statue was the god. The offerings were consumed. Divine presence manifested through proper ritual. These weren't claims requiring rational justification, but experienced realities, empirically verified through the continued existence of their civilization. Ziggurats, the massive stepped pyramids that dominated Mesopotamian cities, embodied this cosmology in architecture. Rising in 3, 4, or 7 stages depending on the structure, they created artificial mountains connecting earth to heaven. At the summit, a small temple provided a meeting place where divine and human realms intersected. The ziggurat at Ur, built around 2100 BCE by King Ur-Nammu, measured roughly 64 meters long, 46 meters wide, and rose to a height of approximately 30 meters above the plain. Imagine the labor required: millions of mud bricks shaped by hand, carried by workers, stacked according to precise plans. Why this effort? Because the gods deserved mountains, spaces elevated above the mundane world, places where sky could be approached and observed. The ziggurat wasn't primarily for human use but divine residence. Though priests climbed its stairs for rituals and astronomical observations, some scholars suggest the temple gardens maintained at ziggurat summits attempted to recreate the sacred garden of the gods described in mythology. a place where divine beings walked in green shade far above the dusty plains. This is the cosmological context for understanding why the Anunnaki needed meals. They walked in temple gardens. They dwelled in houses that required maintenance. They experienced time in ways that involved daily rhythms of waking, eating, resting. Whether this presence was literal in the sense of physical bodies requiring metabolic sustenance, or whether it operated through some framework of animated statues and ritualized devotion, the Sumerians organized their entire civilization around the premise that divine beings were present, engaged, and dependent on human service. The tablets recording those offerings would emerge from this worldview, created by scribes who saw nothing strange in documenting divine meals alongside human rations, because both were equally real, equally necessary to maintain the order that kept chaos at bay and allowed life to continue under the stars that marked time without beginning or end. Writing emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 3400 BCE, not to record myths or royal proclamations, but to manage temple economies. The earliest tablets from Uruk, designated by archaeologists as belonging to the Uruk III and IV periods, contain no literature or poetry. They display pictographic symbols representing concrete objects and quantities. A sheep's head drawn in profile means sheep. A bowl shape means grain. Vertical wedges indicate numbers. The system was a counting ledger, inventory control for institutions managing vast agricultural resources flowing through temple complexes that functioned as economic centers of emerging cities. These proto-cuneiform tablets, roughly 5,000 recovered from Uruk alone, reveal a society already sophisticated in its bureaucratic organization. They list workers receiving rations, calculated according to occupation and status. They record livestock movements, tracking animals from pasture to temple to redistribution. They document textile production, noting raw wool received and finished garments produced. And crucially, they track offerings, specifying what was allocated for divine consumption. The writing system at this stage remained limited, capable of recording transactions but not complex narratives or abstract concepts. Each symbol represented a thing or an action, arranged in standardized sequences that followed predictable formulas. 3 sheep, 5 measures of grain, 2 vessels of beer. The vocabulary served commerce, not contemplation. Over the next few centuries, the system evolved rapidly. Symbols became more abstract, stylized into wedge combinations that could be inscribed faster and more consistently. Phonetic elements appeared, allowing representation of sounds rather than only objects, enabling scribes to record names, grammatical particles, eventually anything speakable. By 2600 BCE, Sumerian cuneiform had developed into a complete writing system capable of expressing full linguistic complexity, including literature, law, correspondence, and extensive religious texts. The tablets documenting Anunnaki meals come primarily from this later period, from the early dynastic Third period through the Third dynasty, roughly 2600 to 2000 BCE. By this era, temple administration had reached remarkable sophistication. Major sanctuaries employed hundreds of personnel, from high priests to sweepers, all receiving rations according to fixed schedules. Archives preserved monthly accounts, yearly summaries, multi-year compilations. The tablets formed an integrated accounting system that modern scholars can trace through cross-references and chronological markers. What makes these offering texts distinctive is their specificity regarding divine recipients. They don't simply list food allocated to the temple generically, but name specific deities receiving specific portions. Enlil at Nippur received different quantities than Inanna at Uruk. The tablets record distinctions between regular daily offerings and special festival provisions. They note seasonal variations, with certain foods appearing only during harvest months or specific ceremonial periods. Consider tablet NTS SH 378 from Drehem, a redistribution center during the III period around 2050 BCE. The text, translated by Assyriologist Stefan Heiser, records offerings for the goddess Ningal. It specifies 1 sheep weighing approximately 35 kilograms, 1 measure of grain calculated at about 480 liters, 1 vessel of beer, ghee, measured at roughly 15 liters, and dates in quantities sufficient for multiple days of offerings. The tablet dates itself to the 7th month of King Shulgi's 41st regnal year, providing chronological precision that allows correlation with other administrative records from the same period. These aren't mythological descriptions, but prosaic accounting, the same bureaucratic tone used for recording rations issued to human workers. The scribes employed standardized terminology, following formats refined over generations of administrative practice. They calculated quantities using the sexagesimal, base 60, mathematical system Mesopotamia would pass to subsequent civilizations. the system that still structures our minutes and seconds, our degrees of arc. The question scholars debate is what these texts reveal about Sumerian belief. Did they consider these offerings literally consumed by divine beings, food that disappeared into some metaphysical dimension, or did they understand the system as symbolic transfer, where earthly food sustained divine presence through ritualized attention, after which the physical substances were consumed by priests and temple workers as their legitimate share of sacred resources? The tablets don't explain the mechanism. They record the transaction without philosophical commentary. 1 sheep to Enlil, delivered, received. The matter-of-fact tone makes interpretation difficult because it assumes shared cultural knowledge that went without saying, premises so obvious to contemporary scribes that explanation seemed unnecessary. Archaeological evidence from temple excavations provides additional context. At Ur, excavations directed by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s uncovered extensive temple kitchens adjacent to sacred precincts. These spaces contained ovens for baking bread, facilities for brewing beer, storage areas for grain and other provisions. The physical infrastructure supported large-scale food preparation, capacities far exceeding what priestly personnel alone would consume. Chemical analysis of ceramic vessels from these contexts sometimes reveals residues consistent with the foods listed in texts. Barley traces in brewing vats, animal fats in cooking pots. The material evidence confirms that actual food preparation occurred in these spaces, that offerings weren't merely symbolic gestures but involved real culinary labor producing consumable products. Yet the ultimate destination of these prepared foods remains uncertain. Were they placed before statues and left until spoilage required removal? Were they consumed during communal feasts where priests and possibly worshippers participated in meals shared with deities? Did different temples follow different practices, varying by local tradition or divine preference? Some texts describe the leftovers of the gods being distributed to temple personnel, suggesting offerings were first presented to divine recipients before human consumption. This pattern appears in many religious traditions, the concept of prasad in Hinduism being perhaps the closest parallel, where food offered to deities becomes blessed and is subsequently consumed by devotees. The Sumerian system may have operated similarly, with offerings transformed through divine contact before entering mundane consumption cycles. The sheer scale documented in these texts is striking. Annual offerings to major deities measured in thousands of animals, tens of thousands of liters of grain and beer. Even accounting for redistribution to temple workers, the quantities suggest either enormous waste, which seems unlikely given agricultural constraints, or consumption patterns we don't fully understand. Perhaps offerings were displayed briefly before swift redistribution. Perhaps smaller symbolic portions were actually presented, while larger quantities were allocated in the deity's name, but immediately directed to human consumption. These mysteries persist because the tablets record practice without explaining rationale. They're data points in a system whose underlying logic required no documentation, being self-evident to practitioners. Modern readers encounter the data stripped of context, like finding a restaurant's purchase orders without knowing what a restaurant does or why humans eat. What remains certain is that writing's very invention connected intimately to tracking divine provisions, that the first human literature emerged from temple accounting, that reading and writing spread through Mesopotamia because institutions needed to document their relationships with gods, who required feeding twice daily, every day, for thousands of years. The wedges pressed into clay carried more than information. They carried a worldview where cosmic order depended on proper transactions between mortal and immortal, where civilization itself rested on maintaining accounts that satisfied both earthly administrators and divine recipients, whose satisfaction meant the difference between abundance and catastrophe. The menu survives in wedge marks pressed into clay across generations. Barley formed the foundation, the grain that thrived in Mesopotamian conditions where wheat struggled. Tablets list barley in multiple forms: whole grain for brewing, flour for bread, groats for porridge. The amounts varied by deity and occasion, but typical daily offerings for major gods included between 200 and 300 liters of barley products. This wasn't symbolic token amounts, but substantial quantities that, if physically delivered, would require multiple workers to transport and process. Bread appears in offering lists under several terms distinguishing types and qualities. Ninda, the general word for bread, could be modified to indicate specific preparations. Nindagug meant thick bread, while Nindazigu meant fine flour bread. Some texts mention bread shaped in specific forms, possibly with symbolic significance, though the tablets rarely explain meaning beyond categorical labels. Bread production required labor-intensive processes, grinding grain between stones, mixing dough, firing clay ovens to temperatures around 300 to 400 degrees Celsius. baking loaves that contemporary recipes suggest weighed between 500 grams and 2 kilograms each. Beer, called kash in Sumerian, appears with remarkable frequency and variety. The standard Sumerian beer list, preserved in multiple copies, catalogues at least 8 distinct types. Kashsig meant fine beer, probably stronger and of higher quality. Kashus referred to ordinary or weak beer, perhaps the daily beverage for workers. Kashidum designated a red or dark beer. Some types specified ingredients. Kashi meant barley beer, while Kashigashtin combined barley with grape or date components. The brewing process described in the hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, involved malting grain through controlled germination, mashing with bread to provide fermentation sugars, and fermenting in large ceramic vessels. The resulting beverage was thick, porridge-like, consumed through straws that filtered out grain solids. Alcohol content varied, probably ranging from 2 to 3% for weak varieties to 8 to 10% for strong festival beers. Daily offerings often specified multiple vessels, suggesting beer consumption by divine recipients paralleled human consumption patterns, where beer provided significant nutritional value, essentially liquid bread, supplying calories and B vitamins. Dates appear frequently, reflecting their importance in Mesopotamian agriculture. Date palms required minimal maintenance once established, tolerated saline soil conditions that challenged other crops, and produced abundant harvests yielding 100 to 200 kilograms per tree annually. Tablets record dates counted by individual fruits or measured by volume. Dried dates stored well, providing sweetness before sugarcane cultivation reached the region. Date syrup, produced by boiling down date juice, served as concentrated sweetener mentioned in some offering contexts. Meat offerings received detailed specification. Sheep were most common, designated by age and sex. Offerings might specify lambs, yearling rams, breeding ewes, wethers. Cattle appeared less frequently, but in significant numbers during major festivals. The tablets sometimes note specific cuts. Shoulder, loin, ribs, organs. Liver held particular significance, used in divination rituals but also presented as choice offering. One text from Lagash, dated to approximately 2400 BCE, describes an offering to the goddess Bao, consisting of 1 ox, 1 ram, 2 lambs, and 7 birds, suggesting combinations rather than single animal presentations. The preparation of these animals required skilled butchers. Archaeological evidence from temple precincts includes bone assemblages, showing consistent cut marks that indicate standardized butchering practices. Animals were typically slaughtered by throat cutting, hung for blood drainage, skinned, and divided into portions according to established patterns. Some texts mention roasting, others boiling in large cauldrons. The methods probably varied by occasion and deity preference. Birds appear in offering lists, though less frequently than sheep. Geese, ducks, and doves are mentioned. Excavations at Ur revealed bones from domestic geese in temple contexts, suggesting these were raised specifically for sacred purposes. Wild birds, captured during seasonal migrations along the Tigris and Euphrates, supplemented domestic stocks during certain months. Dairy products, particularly butter and ghee, clarified butter, appear regularly. Texts specify quantities in litres, typically 5 to 15 litres per offering. Ghee provided cooking fat and lamp fuel, its clarification process producing a stable product, less prone to rancidity than fresh butter. Cheese is mentioned occasionally, though less frequently than liquid dairy products. The importance of dairy offerings makes sense given extensive temple herds documented in administrative records. Fish makes surprisingly rare appearances in offering lists, despite Mesopotamia's rivers and marshlands supporting abundant fish populations. When fish offerings occur, texts usually don't specify species, simply using the generic term for fish. This relative absence may reflect status hierarchies, where fish, commonly available and consumed by ordinary people, seemed less appropriate for divine consumption than prestige foods like sheep and cattle. Vegetables and legumes appear sporadically. Onions and garlic are mentioned, as are lentils and chickpeas. The tablets sometimes list green things, probably referring to various leafy vegetables or herbs, without detailed specification. Fruit beyond dates included figs and pomegranates, both well suited to Mesopotamian climate. Apples and grapes appear in texts from northern Mesopotamia, but rarely in southern Sumerian documents, reflecting regional agricultural differences. Honey represents the most prestigious sweet offering. Mesopotamia lacked sugarcane, making honey the only concentrated sweetener beyond date syrup. Bees were kept in specialized apiaries, though honey remained relatively expensive compared to dates. Offering texts that include honey usually specify small quantities, measured in fractions of liters rather than the bulk amounts typical of grain or beer. The rarity emphasized special status, appropriate for festivals or particularly important petitions to deities. Oil, both sesame and linseed, served cooking and lighting purposes. Tablets distinguish between oils used for food preparation and those designated for anointing statues or burning in lamps. The quantities offered could be substantial, tens of litres for major festivals, suggesting uses beyond what statues alone would require. Wine appears in later texts with increasing frequency, as viticulture spread through the region. Earlier Sumerian periods show minimal wine offerings, but by the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, wine had become more common in temple contexts. The tablets specify origin regions for quality wines, creating a geographic hierarchy where imports from mountainous areas commanded higher status than local date wine. What's notable in these lists is what they reveal about Sumerian diet more broadly. The offerings mirror human consumption patterns, elevated in quality and quantity, but not alien in composition. The gods ate what people ate, in proportions that suggested idealized abundance, rather than completely foreign sustenance. This parallelism supports interpretations that see divine feeding as an extension of hospitality codes, where hosts provided guests with the finest versions of familiar foods. The astronomical quantities recorded across annual cycles suggest either massive communal feasting, where divine offerings fed large populations, or significant spoilage loss if foods were truly reserved exclusively for divine consumption. The logistics of delivering, preparing, and managing these volumes required extensive labor and organization. Temple kitchens operated as industrial-scale production facilities, not small household operations. Take a moment here. Let your breath settle into its own rhythm. These details, these measurements and lists, they're not just ancient accounting. They're evidence of devotion, of civilizations organizing their economic lives around beings whose existence was as real to them as the clay beneath their fingers, the grain in their storerooms, the smoke rising from their ovens into unchanging stars. Leonard Woolley arrived at Tel el-Muqayyar in southern Iraq during the winter of 1922, hired by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania to excavate what local tradition claimed was the ancient city of Ur. The Tell, an artificial mound created by millennia of human occupation, rose roughly 20 meters above the surrounding plain. Woolley's team began systematic trenching, cutting through layers of brick rubble, pottery fragments, and disturbed soil deposited by previous looters and casual diggers. By December, they had reached intact architectural remains, walls still standing to heights of 2 meters, rooms filled with sand but preserving their original configurations. In the temple complex dedicated to Nana, the moon god who served as Ur's patron deity, Woolley's workers uncovered a series of rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The excavation proceeded slowly, clearing fill from each space, documenting architectural features, collecting artifacts found in situ. In one chamber, approximately 8 meters long by 5 meters wide, they found something unexpected, a large circular structure built from fire-hardened brick, its interior blackened with carbon residue, surrounded by ceramic vessels still partially intact, despite being buried for nearly 4,000 years. It was an oven, an industrial-scale bread oven capable of baking dozens of loaves simultaneously, its dimensions and construction suggesting continuous use over extended periods. The surrounding vessels, when analyzed, showed traces consistent with grain storage. Adjacent rooms contained similar features: more ovens, grinding installations where grain was processed into flour, storage areas with ceramic jar fragments bearing administrative seal impressions. Woolley had discovered the temple bakery, the physical infrastructure supporting offering systems documented in countless tablets. The discovery transformed understanding of how temples functioned. These weren't purely symbolic spaces, but active production facilities where raw agricultural goods underwent transformation into prepared foods. The scale of the installations suggested daily operation, feeding not just divine statues but extensive populations dependent on temple distribution systems. Similar discoveries at other sites confirmed the pattern. At Nippur, excavations by the University of Pennsylvania between 1889 and 1900 uncovered the Ekur temple complex dedicated to Enlil, chief of the Sumerian pantheon. Within the sacred precinct, archaeologists found large storage rooms with capacity for thousands of liters of grain, brewing facilities with vats measuring over 1 meter in diameter, and butchering areas evidenced by bone assemblages showing consistent processing patterns. The brewing facilities particularly impressed researchers. Large ceramic vessels, some standing 1.5 meters tall, bore residues analyzed decades later through gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. The chemical signatures confirmed barley fermentation, matching descriptions from contemporary tablets. One installation preserved a strainer system, woven reed or ceramic mesh, that separated liquid from solid grain components during brewing or consumption. The hymn to Ninkasi's poetic description of brewing processes found material confirmation in archaeological remains. At Uruk, excavations spanning the 20th century revealed the Inanna precinct, sacred to Inanna, goddess of war and sexuality. The complex covered roughly 9 hectares, containing multiple temple structures, administrative buildings, and support facilities. Among these, excavators identified kitchens by the presence of ovens, cooking installations, and artifact assemblages dominated by food preparation tools. The kitchens connected directly to storage magazines through corridors that allowed efficient movement of provisions from storage to preparation to presentation. The architecture reveals sophisticated planning. Storage rooms featured raised floors and ventilation systems designed to preserve grain by controlling moisture and temperature. Ovens were positioned to allow smoke venting without fouling sacred spaces. Water channels supplied cleaning and cooking needs. The layout suggests careful attention to workflow efficiency, minimizing labor required to transform raw ingredients into finished offerings. Chemical analysis of soil samples from these kitchen contexts provides additional evidence of food processing activities. At several sites, excavators collected sediment from floor surfaces and analyzed it for organic residues. The tests revealed elevated concentrations of lipids consistent with animal fat, suggesting meat preparation. Starch granules from barley and wheat indicated grain processing. The molecular signatures of these residues survived millennia because they absorbed into clay floors and pottery fragments, where oxygen-free conditions preserved them from complete decomposition. Contemporary tablets sometimes reference these spaces directly, though usually in administrative rather than descriptive contexts. Temple personnel lists include job titles that translate as chief baker, brewer, butcher, miller, suggesting specialized labor forces dedicated to food production. Ration texts document workers receiving payment in grain and other goods, creating economic records that allow estimation of temple kitchen workforce sizes. Major temples employed dozens or even hundreds of people in food production roles. The quantities they processed were substantial. Calculations based on offering texts and worker ration documents suggest annual grain consumption at major temples measured in thousands of tons. Livestock requirements numbered in tens of thousands of animals. The economic impact rippled through entire regions as temple administrators contracted with farmers for grain, arranged shepherds to supply sheep, coordinated transport of provisions from rural production zones to urban temple complexes. This system functioned as a redistribution network, concentrating agricultural surplus in temple centers before reallocating it to workers, priests, and broader populations during festivals. The offerings themselves formed part of this circulation. Gods received first portions, but the physical substances then flowed to human consumption through various channels. Priestly hierarchies received shares according to rank. Temple workers ate as part of their compensation. Festival occasions involved communal feasting where large populations consumed sacred foods in celebratory contexts. The architecture supporting this system reveals how thoroughly Sumerian cities organized themselves around divine feeding. The temples weren't peripheral to urban life but central, both spatially and economically. Cities grew around sanctuaries, not the reverse. The cosmic kitchen operated as a city's economic heart, pumping resources through arteries of redistribution that sustained complex societies numbering in tens of thousands. What motivated this organization? Modern scholars point to practical benefits. Temples served as banks, warehouses, employment centers, social services providers. The religious framework justified and stabilized economic structures that might otherwise have generated resistance. People accepted temple taxation because they believed gods required sustenance, and divine satisfaction meant cosmic order, agricultural abundance, protection from chaos. But from the Sumerian perspective, causation probably ran the opposite direction. The economic benefits were secondary consequences of religious necessity. Gods needed feeding. That fundamental premise drove everything else. The practical benefits that emerged proved divine satisfaction was being achieved, evidence that the system worked, that order prevailed because offerings flowed properly. The kitchen stood as proof of this commitment, spaces where human labor transformed Earth's products into acceptable gifts for beings whose favor meant survival. The ovens still blackened in museum-excavated temple ruins, the grinding stones still bearing wear patterns from processing countless tons of grain, the storage jars still capable of holding provisions, all bear witness to a civilization that fed its gods with the same seriousness it fed its children. And the tablets recording those offerings, pressed in offices adjacent to these kitchens by scribes who could smell bread baking and hear brewers working, preserved accounts that allow us, 4 millennia later, to reconstruct not just what was offered, but how the system functioned, how belief translated into architecture, economics, daily labor performed by thousands who accepted as obvious truth that the stars shining above their city walls watched through divine eyes that required earthly sustenance to remain attentive to human concerns. Dawn in ancient Ur began not with light but with sound. The city stirring before the sun cleared the eastern horizon. Temple kitchens activated in darkness. Workers arriving through narrow streets still cool from night. Ovens that had smoldered overnight received fresh fuel, their fires coaxed to baking temperatures, while bakers shaped dough prepared during previous evening hours. The aroma of heating bread mingled with smoke, drifting across courtyards where priests performed ablutions, preparing themselves for the day's first sacred duty. The morning offering, called the opening of the mouth ceremony, occurred as solar disk touched the horizon. Timing mattered. The ritual required synchronization between celestial movement and human action, the moment when night surrendered to day and gods awakened from rest to resume their attention to earthly affairs. Missing this timing risked divine displeasure, the consequences ranging from minor misfortune to catastrophic failure of crops or military endeavors. Priests approached the inner sanctum where the cult statue resided, carrying prepared offerings on ceramic platters and in specialized vessels. The statue, approximately life-sized in major temples though smaller representations existed in subsidiary shrines, stood on a platform against the rear wall. During night hours, curtains screened it from view. The morning ceremony began by drawing these curtains back, symbolically awakening the deity, opening divine eyes to witness offerings presented. The food arrived in careful arrangement. Bread, still warm from ovens, was placed on offering tables positioned before the statue. Beer in ceramic vessels, their surfaces sometimes decorated with geometric patterns or divine symbols, stood alongside. Meat portions, when included in morning offerings, had been roasted or boiled during pre-dawn hours. The quantities varied by deity and date, but typical morning presentations included between 10 and 20 loaves of bread, 5 to 8 vessels of beer, portions of butter or ghee measured in liters, and dates calculated by count or volume. Priests recited prayers during presentation, formulaic phrases repeated daily across centuries. The words survive in ritual texts, though their exact pronunciation remains debated by scholars who reconstruct ancient Sumerian phonology from written cuneiform that recorded consonants more reliably than vowels. The prayers addressed deities by name and epithet, recounting their powers and asking continued favor. Some prayers listed offerings item by item, essentially providing verbal inventory matching physical presentation. After placement, the offerings remained before the statue for a period tablets describe but don't precisely quantify. Hours, certainly. Long enough that bread cooled, beer settled, the immediate presence of human handlers faded. During this interval, divine consumption was understood to occur, though texts don't explain mechanism. The food didn't physically disappear, didn't show visible signs of consumption, yet Sumerians accepted that gods absorbed essential nutritional or spiritual elements, leaving material components behind for subsequent human use. The afternoon provided rest period for deities. Temple activity decreased during hours when sun blazed highest, and heat made labor oppressive. Gods, like humans, required refuge from Mesopotamian summer temperatures that regularly exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. The sanctums were designed for coolness, their thick mud brick walls providing thermal mass that moderated interior temperatures. Priests closed curtains again, allowing divine residents privacy during midday repose. Evening offerings followed a similar pattern to morning rituals, but occurred as sun approached western horizon. The timing again required precision, coordinating human activity with celestial cycles. Evening meals often included different menu items than morning presentations. Some texts specify more elaborate preparations for evening, possibly because food prepared during cooler morning hours could be more complex than items prepared during afternoon heat. The two-meal pattern mirrors human eating schedules, documented in various ancient cultures. 2 substantial meals daily, morning and evening, with perhaps light refreshment during afternoon, provided nutrition without requiring constant food preparation. The parallelism suggests Sumerian conceptions of divine needs drew directly from human experience, projecting familiar patterns onto supernatural beings. Yet questions persist. Did Sumerians truly believe invisible consumption occurred? Archaeological evidence shows offerings were subsequently redistributed to priests and workers, so physical substances weren't destroyed or removed from human access. But this redistribution might have been understood as consuming blessed leftovers, food transformed by divine contact, even if material form remained unchanged. The distinction between symbolic and literal may not have existed in Sumerian thought as it does in modern frameworks. Seasonal variations complicated the basic two-meal structure. Festivals required special offerings, multiplying quantities and introducing rare foods reserved for particular celebrations. The Akitu festival, marking New Year, involved elaborate multi-day ceremonies with offerings far exceeding daily norms. Texts describe processions carrying foods through city streets, banquets where gods from different temples met as guests at host deities' sanctuary, theatrical performances depicting mythological events. These special occasions revealed another dimension of divine feeding, its social and political functions. When city-states allied, their patron deities exchanged visits and shared meals. When conflicts arose, offering patterns changed, reflecting diplomatic tensions through religious vocabulary. The meals weren't purely about sustenance but relationship maintenance, cosmic diplomacy conducted through careful protocol that mirrored human aristocratic practices. Monthly cycles also influenced offerings. The moon's phases structured Mesopotamian calendars, creating rhythms that governed both agricultural and religious activities. New moon and full moon required special presentations. Certain months demanded particular offerings based on seasonal availability and mythological associations. The system was complex, requiring specialized knowledge to execute properly. Who consumed the material offerings after divine portion was satisfied? Temple hierarchies determined distribution. High priests received choice portions. Lower-ranking clergy got smaller shares. Workers in temple kitchens, scribes in administrative offices, guards at temple gates, all received rations that included portions of offerings after ritual presentation. The system functioned as payment, compensating service through access to sacred foods. This redistribution meant divine feeding supported extensive populations. A major temple might employ hundreds of people directly, with thousands more indirectly dependent through extended families and service providers. The offerings flowing into temples as religious obligation flowed back out as economic sustenance, creating circulation that sustained urban populations. Imagine standing in a temple courtyard at dusk, watching priests carry platters toward the sanctum. The smell of bread and roasted meat drifts on evening air. Somewhere a priest chants prayers in language already ancient when these prayers were first composed. The statue inside waits, its painted eyes fixed on the doorway where offerings will soon appear. Stars begin appearing overhead, the same stars that watched this scene enacted yesterday, last year, generations ago. The routine possessed hypnotic quality through its repetition. Day after day, year after year, century following century, the meals continued. The system's persistence across such spans suggests deep cultural investment, resources directed toward divine feeding that might otherwise have supported armies, construction projects, or population expansion. Yet Sumerians considered this investment foundational, not optional, the price of cosmic order that made all other activities possible. Beneath this routine, though, questions lingered in cuneiform silences, questions about what occurred when curtains closed and priests withdrew, questions about divine nature and need, questions we still ask, reading tablets that document practice without explaining belief. The hymn to Ninkasi stands unique among Sumerian religious poetry because it doubles as brewing recipe, divine praise containing technical instructions, precise enough that modern brewers have successfully recreated ancient Mesopotamian beer by following its verses. The goddess Ninkasi, whose name translates roughly as lady who fills the mouth, presided over fermentation, that transformation where grain and water became intoxicating nourishment. The hymn, composed around 1800 BCE but probably preserving much older oral traditions, describes her actions as cosmic processes while simultaneously detailing practical brewing steps. Poetry and instruction merged into single text, preserved on multiple tablets that allowed comparison of versions and confident reconstruction of damaged passages. The process began with bapia, a twice-baked barley bread that served as fermentation starter. Bakers prepared this specially, mixing malted barley flour with dates and water, shaping loaves, baking them partially, then baking again until hard and dry. The double baking killed competing microorganisms while preserving enzymes necessary for fermentation. Stored bapia remained viable for months, providing brewers with stable starter culture before yeast isolation was understood as biological process. On brewing day, workers broke bapia into pieces and mixed it with water in large ceramic vessels. The hymn describes this as ninkasi, mixing bapia with sweet aromatics, suggesting additional ingredients beyond basic bread and water. Date honey probably provided additional fermentable sugars. Herbs or spices might have contributed flavoring, though texts rarely specify which plants were used. The mixture sat for several hours, while enzymes from malted grain converted starches into sugars yeast could metabolize. Fresh malted barley came next, grain that had been soaked, allowed to germinate until shoots appeared, then dried to halt growth. Germination activated enzymes that would break down grain starches during brewing. The timing of this malting process affected beer's final character. Short germination produced sweeter, less alcoholic beer. Extended germination yielded stronger, more fermentable product. Brewers controlled strength and flavor through decisions made days before actual brewing began. The mixture went into clay vessels called hashur, large jars with capacity ranging from 50 to 200 liters depending on production scale. Archaeological excavations have recovered these vessels still bearing residues analyzable through modern chemical techniques. One vessel from Tolbazi in Syria, dated to around 2700 BCE, contained molecular signatures of calcium oxalate, a compound formed during barley beer fermentation. The presence of this specific marker confirmed the vessel had held beer rather than wine or other fermented beverages. Fermentation required several days. Wild yeasts present on grain surfaces, and brewing equipment colonize the sugar-rich liquid, metabolizing sugars and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. The process occurred at ambient temperature, which in Mesopotamian climate meant quite warm conditions by modern brewing standards. High-temperature fermentation produces distinctive flavor compounds, fruity esters and phenolic notes that characterize traditional styles still brewed in warm climates. The hymn describes the result as the filtering vat which makes pleasant sound, referencing the bubbling of active fermentation. Brewers monitored this activity, judging fermentation progress by sound and appearance. When bubbling ceased, fermentation was complete, and beer ready for consumption or transfer to storage vessels. But fresh beer remained cloudy with suspended grain particles and dead yeast. Consuming it required straws, long tubes made from reeds or precious metals for elite users. The straw's bottom end contained a filter, woven reed or perforated metal, that blocked solids while allowing liquid to pass. Cylinder seals from the period frequently depict drinking scenes where multiple people share a large vessel, using individual straws, suggesting beer consumption was social activity, not solitary drinking. The III period texts, those administrative documents from around 2100 to 2000 BCE, reveal the scale of temple brewing operations. Monthly accounts from Drehim list beer production in hundreds of vessels, calculated according to strength and quality. Workers received beer as part of their rations, amounts varying by occupation and status. A laborer might receive 2 liters of ordinary beer daily, while skilled craftsmen got 3 to 4 liters, and administrators or priests received portions of strong beer, in addition to larger volumes of ordinary varieties. In the temple complex at during the reign of King Shulgi around 2050 BCE, the brewing supervisor named Nungal managed production that supplied both divine offerings and worker rations. His seal impression appears on tablets recording monthly beer production, totaling over 10,000 liters. The administrative burden was substantial, tracking barley and bapper inventory, scheduling production to ensure fresh beer availability, coordinating with offering schedules that required specific beer types for different deities and festivals. One month, the tablets record, production fell short due to unexpected barley quality issues. The grain delivered from fields showed signs of moisture damage, reducing its usability for brewing. Ernugal faced a choice: use compromised grain and produce inferior beer, or delay production until better supplies arrived, risking gaps in offering schedules and worker rations. He chose delay, ordering additional barley from emergency temple reserves, while sending complaints to the agricultural supervisors, whose oversight had allowed damaged grain to enter temple stores. The tablets preserve his bureaucratic correspondence, formal complaints written in standard administrative language. "The barley you sent is not fit for the goddess," one tablet states. "Supply proper grain or explain the deficiency to higher authority." The situation resolved within days. Fresh barley arrived. Production resumed at rates sufficient to cover the shortfall. Ernungal's tablets from the following month show normal volumes restored. The crisis managed without catastrophic disruption to divine or human consumption. The incident, mundane as administrative crises go, reveals the human dimension beneath ritual and religious ideology. Ernungal was neither mystic nor philosopher, but practical manager, solving logistical problems with resources available. Yet his work sustained systems Sumerians considered essential to cosmic order. The beer he supervised fed gods and humans, maintained social hierarchies through differential rations, enabled festivals that reinforced community identity. Modern brewers who have recreated Ninkasi beer, following the hymn's instructions, report a beverage quite unlike contemporary commercial beers. It's cloudy, slightly sour, with noticeable fruity notes and moderate alcohol content around 3 to 5% by volume. The taste combines bread-like maltiness with date sweetness and herbal complexity. It's refreshing in hot climates, providing hydration, calories, and B vitamins in stable sanitary form when water sources were often contaminated. For Sumerians, this wasn't primitive precursor to modern beer, but sophisticated achievement, technology refined over centuries to produce consistent results under challenging conditions. The dedication of production to divine recipients elevated the entire process, made brewing sacred work rather than mere craft. When priests poured beer before cult statues, they offered something humans had transformed through knowledge, labor, and collaboration with invisible forces that turned sugar into alcohol. The fermentation remained mysterious even as the process became routine. Brewers didn't understand yeast biology, didn't know microorganisms cause transformation, yet they controlled conditions that enabled it. That gap between effective practice and theoretical understanding characterized much ancient technology. They knew what worked without knowing why. Perhaps that mystery made beer particularly appropriate offering for gods. It was transformation made visible, mundane ingredients becoming something greater through processes that seemed almost magical. The bubbling fermentation, the intoxicating effect, the preservation and nutrition, all suggested divine involvement in everyday alchemy. The stars above Mesopotamian breweries, those same stars shining as we listen tonight, marked the passage of days and seasons that structured brewing schedules, harvest times that determined grain availability, festivals that required special production runs. The cycles continued. Beer flowed from temple vessels into divine offerings and human cups, and the hymn to Ninkasi preserved in wedge marks both prayer and procedure, honoring the goddess while teaching her craft. Some offerings exceeded daily routine, entering the realm of spectacular display, where divine hospitality mirrored royal extravagance at scales that suggested either symbolic calculation or genuine intention to impress supernatural guests. The banquet texts, particularly those describing festivals for Inanna at Uruk, detail preparations that required months of advanced planning. One tablet from the early dynastic period, around 2450 BCE, lists provisions for a single festival: 50 cattle, 200 sheep, 300 containers of beer, 1,000 loaves of bread, along with proportional amounts of dairy products, dates, and other accompaniments. The livestock alone represented wealth equivalent to supporting a small village for a year, concentrated into multi-day celebration. These festivals served multiple functions simultaneously. They honored deities on calendrically significant dates, often coinciding with astronomical events or agricultural milestones. They demonstrated royal piety and economic power, showing the king could mobilize resources sufficient to satisfy divine appetites at unprecedented scales. They redistributed wealth through communal feasting, allowing populations who contributed through taxation to participate in consumption of offerings after divine portions were satisfied. And they reinforced social hierarchies, with seating arrangements, portion sizes, and meat cuts distributed according to rank and status. The preparations revealed sophisticated logistical coordination. Cattle and sheep had to be acquired from herds maintained for this purpose, transported to the city, held in pens near the temple until slaughter times, then processed by teams of butchers working in coordinated sequence. The meat underwent different preparations, some roasted on spits over open fires, some boiled in large cauldrons, some dried or preserved for extended festival duration. Archaeological remains from temple courtyards include fire-cracked stones and carbonized bone assemblages, indicating intensive cooking activities concentrated in specific periods. Bread production for festivals stressed temple bakeries beyond normal capacity. The 1,000 loaves mentioned in that Uruk text would require multiple ovens operating continuously for days, consuming tons of flour that had to be ground, stored, distributed to baking teams. The logistics challenged even sophisticated temple administrations, requiring supplementary labor recruited from broader populations. Some tablets record emergency hiring of additional bakers and brewers during festival months, temporary workers paid in rations and small silver payments. The banquet settings, when they can be reconstructed from textual descriptions and archaeological remains, occupied temple courtyards or specially constructed pavilions. Tables, probably low platforms where guests reclined on mats or cushions in Mesopotamian fashion, filled available space. Torches and oil lamps provided illumination for evening portions of multi-day celebrations. Musicians performed, their presence documented in texts listing payments to drummers, flute players, singers. The soundscape combined music, conversation, prayers, chanted at intervals, animal sounds from pens, holding yet-to-be-slaughtered offerings. The divine family featured prominently in banquet narratives. Major festivals involved not just the host deity, but divine relatives and allies who were conceptualized as traveling from their home temples to attend celebrations. The texts describe elaborate diplomatic protocols, proper greetings when guest deities arrived, processional routes through city streets, seating arrangements in banquet spaces that reflected mythological relationships and hierarchies. Inanna's festivals at Uruk included her father An from nearby temples, her brother Utu the sun god, various attendant deities and divine servants. This raises fascinating questions about Sumerian cosmology. Were these traveling deities represented by their cult statues, physically transported between temples? Some texts mention divine images journeying by boat along canals, accompanied by priests and offerings. Other passages suggest a more abstract divine presence, the deity's attention and favor directed toward the host city, without literal statue movement. The ambiguity persists across sources, possibly reflecting varied interpretations coexisting within Sumerian religion rather than single orthodox understanding. The food itself underwent transformations through festival context. Regular offerings followed standardized protocols, but festival meals experimented with rare ingredients and elaborate preparations. Exotic birds captured specifically for festivals appeared on divine tables. Honey cakes shaped in symbolic forms represented mythological scenes. Imported wine from mountainous regions supplemented local date wine and beer. The diversity demonstrated both the reach of temple economic networks and the importance Sumerians placed on impressing divine guests with novel experiences. One particularly detailed text, preserved in fragmentary form across multiple tablets, describes the 7-day Akitu festival celebrating the new year. The account specifies daily menus that varied in composition and scale. Day 1 emphasized bread and beer, establishing the festival's foundation with staple foods. Day 2 introduced meat offerings in modest quantities. By day 4, the peak of the celebration, cattle and sheep were slaughtered in numbers that required coordination of multiple butchery teams working from dawn to dusk. The final days tapered gradually, reducing portions while maintaining ceremonial structure until the festival concluded and normal daily routines resumed. What happened to surplus food from these massive preparations? The quantities listed in texts exceed what even large priestly populations could consume during festival durations, some undoubtedly spoiled, especially meat in Mesopotamian heat. But texts also describe distribution to broader populations. Commoners receiving portions after sacred portions were satisfied. The festivals functioned as periodic wealth redistribution, where agricultural surplus concentrated in temple hands flowed back to populations through ceremonial consumption. This economic function may explain the system's persistence. Yes, Sumerians believed gods required feeding, but the practice also stabilized societies prone to wealth concentration and resource inequality. The regular festivals, with their massive offerings and subsequent redistribution, prevented excessive accumulation while maintaining divine approval as the apparent motivation. People accepted heavy taxation because offerings benefited everyone eventually, blessed by divine contact before consumption. Yet the texts maintain earnest tone when describing divine satisfaction with these banquets. Prayers thank gods for accepting offerings, express relief when festivals conclude successfully, without divine anger, manifesting through natural disasters or military defeats. The economic benefits were real, but so was the religious devotion driving their creation. The two dimensions intertwined inseparably. Imagine the scene: thousands gathered in temple courtyards, smoke from cooking fires dimming stars, music and prayer blending with conversation, the smell of roasted meat pervading the city, oil lamps flickering on divine statues, positioned to preside over the celebration. For those present, this wasn't performance or economic mechanism, but reality. The gods made present through offerings that satisfied and pleased, ensuring continued cosmic order for another season. The banquet texts preserve this world, their bureaucratic inventories documenting not just quantities but investment, devotion translated into measurable resources expended for beings whose satisfaction meant everything, to those who fed them beneath stars that marked time, witnessed feasts, and continued their courses regardless of the worship occurring below. The dedication of so much human effort to feeding gods reveals fundamental patterns in how ancient minds constructed reality and relationship. When we examine what Sumerians offered to the Anunnaki, we're not just studying ancient diet or religious practice, but encountering a window into consciousness itself, the frameworks through which people understood causation, reciprocity, and the unseen forces shaping their existence. The meal records weren't incidental details, but central evidence of worldview, where divine and human spheres overlapped through tangible exchange. The choice to feed gods rather than merely praise them suggests important assumptions about divine nature. Praise acknowledges power and inspires favor through flattery, requiring no physical transaction beyond words. But feeding implies need, vulnerability, ongoing dependence that creates mutual obligation. The Sumerian pantheon possessed immense power, but also required sustenance, creating relationship structure where humans held leverage through their capacity to satisfy or withhold divine needs. This reciprocity provided psychological comfort in an unpredictable world. When floods destroyed crops, when drought withered fields, when plague struck populations, Sumerians could interpret these as divine hunger expressing itself through withdrawal of favor. The solution became clear: increase offerings, improve quality, ensure proper ritual execution. This framework granted agency in situations that might otherwise feel helpless. Humans couldn't control weather, but they could control offerings, thus influencing divine mood and potentially altering outcomes. The specificity of offerings reveals another dimension. Gods didn't require generic sustenance, but particular foods in particular quantities prepared through particular methods. This detailed framework created knowledge systems, specialized expertise in determining appropriate offerings for different deities, occasions, petitions. Priests developed and guarded this knowledge, their social status deriving partly from exclusive understanding of divine preferences. The complexity reinforced priestly authority, while providing framework that felt empirically verifiable through consequences of proper versus improper offerings. Modern readers sometimes interpret ancient religious practices as purely instrumental, calculating strategies to manipulate supernatural forces, but the Sumerian texts suggest more nuanced relationship. The language describing offerings often expresses affection, gratitude, desire to please beings they genuinely revered. When tablets thank gods for accepting meals, when prayers express joy at divine satisfaction, these seem authentic emotional expressions rather than cynical manipulation. The relationship combined pragmatic transaction with genuine devotion. The parallelism between divine and human needs created familiarity that bridged the vast gulf between mortal and immortal. A god who ate bread understood human concerns about harvest. A deity who drank beer shared human pleasure in fermentation's mysterious transformation. This anthropomorphism, often dismissed by modern scholars as primitive projection, actually created profound connection. The gods weren't alien forces beyond comprehension, but magnified versions of humans, sharing our appetites even while exceeding our powers. Yet this familiarity contained paradox. Gods ate but apparently didn't metabolize food as humans did. They consumed offerings but left physical substances intact for human consumption. They required feeding twice daily but never experienced aging or death, despite millennia without meals during periods when temples fell to ruin. The contradictions suggest Sumerians accepted complexity rather than demanding logical consistency, comfortable holding multiple interpretations simultaneously. The astronomical associations provide another layer. Many major deities corresponded to celestial bodies: Sin the moon, Shamash the sun, Inanna the Venus. Feeding these gods meant nourishing forces that governed celestial cycles, the movements that structured time and seasons. The offerings became cosmic maintenance, human contribution to order that kept stars on course and calendars reliable. This framework elevated mundane food preparation into participation in universal stability. The system's persistence across millennia demonstrates its success in meeting psychological, social, and economic needs. Temple economies thrived for thousands of years, surviving political transformations, foreign conquests, dynastic changes. The basic pattern of divine feeding survived because it worked on multiple levels. It organized agricultural surplus, stabilized social hierarchies, provided meaning and agency, connected humans to cosmic processes, and satisfied deep psychological needs for relationship with powers beyond human control. Consider what this reveals about human nature more broadly. We are creatures who imagine invisible beings and then feed them. We create elaborate systems to maintain relationships with entities we cannot directly perceive. We invest enormous resources in practices whose efficacy cannot be measured objectively. This isn't unique to ancient Mesopotamia, but appears across cultures and millennia, suggesting deep cognitive patterns rather than cultural accident. The question of whether Sumerians believed literally or symbolically may be unanswerable because it imposes modern categories. Their consciousness might not have divided reality into physical versus metaphorical as sharply as contemporary thought does. The offerings were real, the gods were real, the consumption was real. All these could be simultaneously true without requiring explanation or resolution of apparent contradictions. What remains certain is that when we read tablets listing barley and beer and lamb allocated to Anunnaki, we're encountering humans who took divine feeding seriously enough to document it with accounting precision applied to human rations. They treated immortal appetites as administrative matter, requiring bureaucratic oversight, which suggests not doubt about divine reality, but absolute confidence in its mundane integration with daily life. the imagination that created this system, that conceived cosmic order maintained through meals, that invested resources and labor into feeding invisible residents of temple sanctums, reveals capacity for belief that modern secular cultures sometimes struggle to comprehend. Yet the human impulse persists. Manifesting in different forms but recognizably similar, we still offer gifts to forces we cannot control, still seek favor through symbolic actions, still organize our lives around maintaining relationships with the unseen. The stars above Mesopotamian temples, those same points of light still visible tonight if you can find dark sky away from modern illumination, witnessed this particular expression of universal human tendency. They watched priests carry offerings, heard prayers spoken in dead languages, saw smoke rise from altars where gods were fed, and humans found meaning in the ritual exchange. But beneath the recorded meals and documented offerings, beneath the architectural remains and chemical residues analyzed by archaeologists, questions remain that the tablets cannot answer, mysteries preserved, not in what the texts say, but in what they assume without explanation. The term Anunnaki appears across thousands of years of Mesopotamian literature, its meaning shifting subtly through different periods and contexts, never quite settling into single definition. In the earliest Sumerian texts from the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the word refers collectively to the great gods, distinguishing them from lesser divine beings and spirits. The etymology remains debated, but most scholars pass it as princely offspring, or those of royal blood, derived from the Sumerian words for prince Nuna and offspring or seed ki. This suggests divine aristocracy, beings born to rule and authority, rather than created for service. The mythology surrounding them evolved through time. In creation accounts, particularly the Atrahasis epic composed in Old Babylonian period around 1700 BCE, but drawing on older Sumerian traditions, the Anunnaki appear as junior deities assigned physical labor. The epic describes how the great gods Anu, Enlil, and Enki divided cosmic responsibilities. Anu ruled heaven, Enlil governed earth and atmosphere. Enki controlled the underground freshwater ocean called the Abzu. The Anunnaki were assigned to dig irrigation canals, clear fields, perform agricultural work necessary for cosmic order. The texts describe their rebellion with remarkable sympathy. After 40 years of exhausting labor, the Anunnaki gathered in protest, burning their tools and surrounding Enlil's house in the middle of the night. The load is excessive. They are killing us, their spokesman declared. The toil is too heavy. It has made us weak. The gods faced crisis. The work was necessary, but the workers were suffering. The solution came from Enki, who proposed creating humans from clay mixed with divine blood to serve as replacement labor force. This narrative frames human existence in starkly practical terms. We weren't created for abstract spiritual purposes, but to perform physical labor the gods found burdensome. Our role was maintaining civilization through agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and crucially, preparing offerings that fed divine beings who no longer wished to feed themselves. Its pragmatic cosmology, divine-human relationship, based on mutual need rather than love or moral imperative. But the Anunnaki's characterization shifted in later mythology. By the 1st millennium BCE, texts increasingly associated them with the underworld, transformed from agricultural laborers into judges who determined fates of the dead. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes them sitting in council in the realm of the dead, rendering judgments that could not be appealed. This darker role retained their authority while relocating their primary sphere of influence below Earth rather than upon it. The number of Anunnaki varies across sources. Some texts mention 7 great Anunnaki, others reference 50, still others use the term more broadly to encompass hundreds of divine beings. The inconsistency suggests the category remained somewhat fluid, defined more by function and status than fixed membership. They were the gods who mattered, the beings whose actions shaped cosmic and earthly events, distinguished from countless minor spirits and demons who inhabited Mesopotamian supernatural landscape. Their relationship to specific named deities creates additional complexity. Major gods like Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and Nanna were certainly Anunnaki, but were all Anunnaki major gods? The texts don't clarify boundaries. Some passages treat Anunnaki as collective term for the divine assembly. Others seem to reference a distinct group within that assembly. The ambiguity persists across sources. What's striking in these textual descriptions is how rarely they detail the Anunnaki's daily existence. We learn of their mythological roles, their cosmic responsibilities, their relationships with each other and with humans, but the mundane details of divine life, the information that might answer questions about whether they truly ate and drank and slept, remain largely absent from mythological texts. The creation epics don't describe divine meals. The heroic narratives don't show gods consuming food except in rare instances serving plot functions. This is why the administrative tablets are so valuable. While myths describe cosmic dramas, the ration text document routine, they reveal not what gods did in legendary time, but what was done for them in historical time, by humans who believed these beings dwelt in temple sanctums and required daily service. The disconnect between mythological silence and administrative documentation creates space for interpretation and speculation. Zecharia Sitchin entered this space with radical reinterpretation, arguing in his 1976 book The 12th Planet that the Anunnaki were not mythological beings, but extraterrestrial visitors from a planet called Nibiru. He translated Sumerian texts in ways most scholars reject, reading astronomical references as descriptions of solar system formation and ancient knowledge of planetary orbits. In Sitchin's framework, the Anunnaki came to Earth seeking gold for atmospheric purposes, genetically engineered humans as mining labor, and required physical sustenance because they were biological entities, not spiritual abstractions. Mainstream scholarship dismisses Sitchin's translations as fundamentally flawed. Assyriologists point to numerous errors in his reading of cuneiform, mistranslations of key terms, and interpretations that ignore linguistic context and grammatical structure. The academic consensus holds that Sumerian texts describe religious mythology, not historical encounters with space travelers. The Anunnaki were how Mesopotamians conceptualized divine forces, not how they recorded alien contact. Yet Sitchin's work found enormous popular audience, speaking to hunger for alternative histories and explanations of ancient mysteries. His books sold millions of copies, inspired documentaries and subsequent authors who expanded his theories. The appeal partly stems from the texts themselves, which do contain unusual details that can seem suggestive when read outside scholarly context. References to gods descending from heaven, to their superior knowledge and technology, to their genetic role in human creation, all become more literally interpretable when freed from mythological framework. The question of how to read ancient texts remains genuinely complex. Modern readers approach them with different assumptions than original audiences held. When Sumerians wrote that gods came down from heaven, did they mean literal physical descent from sky, or metaphorical divine manifestation? When texts describe Anunnaki teaching human civilization skills, was this attributed divine instruction in real historical events, or mythological explanation for cultural development? The administrative tablets showing divine rations don't resolve these questions. They prove Sumerians performed offerings and documented them carefully. They don't prove whether practitioners believed gods physically consumed offerings, or whether some more complex understanding operated where material and spiritual dimensions interacted in ways modern categories don't capture. What we can say with confidence is that the Anunnaki occupied central position in Mesopotamian religious thought for over 3,000 years. Whether understood as mythological symbols, spiritual beings, misremembered historical visitors, or some combination that defies simple categorization, they shaped how civilizations organized themselves, allocated resources, and understood human purpose within cosmic order. The tablets preserving their names, and the offerings allocated to them, represent one of humanity's longest-running documentary records, spanning millennia, during which languages changed, empires rose and fell, and populations forgot and remembered and forgot again. Through all that transformation, the core pattern persisted. Divine beings required service, and humans provided it through labor that included feeding them according to schedules as precise as any maintained for human royalty. The stars above Mesopotamian ziggurats, those celestial bodies some Anunnaki were identified with, continued their courses while human understanding of the gods evolved, the names and stories changing, while the basic relationship of service and offering remained constant, across generations too numerous to count. The conventional archaeological interpretation treats Sumerian offering texts as religious ritual documentation, symbolic acts maintaining social and economic systems through supernatural framework. This view emphasizes practical functions, temples as redistribution centers, offerings as taxation method, divine feeding as ideological justification for resource extraction from agricultural populations. The gods weren't real in physical sense, but powerful social constructs that enabled complex civilization by legitimizing authority and coordinating labor. When priests presented offerings to statues, they enacted theater that reinforced cosmic order beliefs, while actually serving economic purposes. This framework explains much. It accounts for the massive scale of temple operations, the bureaucratic precision of documentation, the integration of religious and economic systems. It fits patterns observed across many ancient cultures, where religious institutions accumulated wealth and power through supernatural claims, The interpretation treats ancient peoples as sophisticated political actors using religion strategically, even if they genuinely believe the supernatural claims underlying their actions. But this scholarly consensus faces questions from multiple directions. Some ask whether we're projecting modern materialism onto ancient consciousness, assuming they must have understood their practices as primarily economic with religious overlay, when perhaps the reverse was true. Maybe religious reality was primary, and economic benefits were fortunate side effects rather than hidden motivations. The distinction matters for understanding ancient minds, though both interpretations acknowledge the same evidence. Alternative frameworks venture further from academic mainstream. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, popularized by Erich von Däniken and developed extensively by Sitchin, proposes the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings requiring actual physical sustenance during their time on Earth. In this reading, the offering texts document real provisioning of biological entities whose nutritional needs resembled human requirements because both species evolved under similar constraints. The theory points to specific textual details as evidence. References to gods descending from heaven become spacecraft landings. Descriptions of divine radiance and brilliance suggest advanced technology rather than metaphorical glory. The Anunnaki's teaching of civilization skills to humans reflects actual knowledge transfer from advanced species. Most provocatively, passages describing genetic manipulation in human creation align with modern biotechnology concepts, suggesting ancient peoples recorded historical events they witnessed but couldn't explain in scientific terms. Why would extraterrestrials need food? The theory suggests biological entities require nutrition regardless of technological advancement. If Anunnaki were physical beings from another planet, they would have metabolisms demanding caloric intake. The specificity of offering lists, the attention to quantities and quality, makes more sense if recipients actually consumed provisions rather than if the entire system was symbolic performance. Mainstream scholars respond that this interpretation requires selective reading and mistranslation. The Sumerian and Akkadian languages have grammatical structures and idiomatic expressions that ancient astronaut theorists often misread or ignore. Terms translated as sky or heaven can mean abstract realm of divinity rather than literal outer space. References to divine descent use vocabulary that mythological contexts throughout ancient Near East employ metaphorically, not as historical reporting. The mathematical precision of Sumerian astronomy gets cited by both sides. Conventional scholars see it as impressive achievement by careful observers tracking celestial patterns over generations. Alternative theorists suggest knowledge too advanced for Stone Age humans, requiring external instruction from beings with superior understanding. The base 60 mathematical system, still used in modern timekeeping and angular measurement, demonstrates sophistication that alternative researchers argue couldn't have developed independently. Yet astronomical precision doesn't require extraterrestrial explanation. Human capacity for patient observation and pattern recognition, applied over sufficient time with strong motivation, produces remarkable results. Mesopotamian priests had compelling reasons to track celestial cycles, agricultural timing, flood prediction, calendar maintenance, religious ceremonies. Over centuries, accumulated observations created detailed astronomical knowledge without requiring external teachers. Another interpretive stream approaches the text through esoteric and mystical frameworks. Some researchers propose the Anunnaki represented interdimensional beings, entities existing in reality configurations that occasionally intersect with physical world. The offerings might have provided energy or essence these beings required, with physical food serving as medium for energy transfer rather than nutritional source. This interpretation draws from various mystical traditions, suggesting spiritual entities feed on subtle emanations from material substances. This framework explains some puzzling aspects. If offerings were purely symbolic, why such specificity? If gods were entirely spiritual, why physical needs? The interdimensional interpretation proposes a middle ground. Beings real but not physical, in ways we typically understand, requiring sustenance but not through biological metabolism. The temples served as intersection points where dimensions touched, allowing energy transfer through ritualized presentation of offerings. Mainstream scholarship generally dismisses such frameworks as unfalsifiable speculation, lacking evidentiary standards. Without methods to detect or measure interdimensional beings, the hypothesis can't be tested or refined through research. It remains a possibility that can't be disproven, but also can't be investigated using available tools. Jungian psychological interpretation offers yet another lens. Carl Jung saw gods as archetypes, psychological patterns existing in collective unconscious. The Anunnaki might represent projections of human psyche, aspects of consciousness personified and externalized. Feeding them becomes feeding those aspects of ourselves, acknowledging and honoring psychological needs through externalized ritual. The specificity of offerings reflects specificity of psychological states requiring attention and integration. This framework treats religion as sophisticated psychological technology rather than supernatural engagement. The Sumerians weren't worshipping external beings, but developing internal wholeness through externalized symbolic actions. Whether they understood this consciously matters less than the psychological functions the system served. Each interpretation highlights different evidence and serves different contemporary needs. Conventional archaeology satisfies scholars seeking materialist explanations grounded in anthropological patterns. Ancient astronaut theories appeal to those who find conventional narratives unsatisfying and prefer extraordinary possibilities. Mystical frameworks attract people combining spiritual inclinations with ancient history interests. Psychological readings suit those viewing religion as human psychological expression. What unites these varied interpretations is the shared source material, clay tablets pressed by scribes who believed enough in what they documented to preserve it with bureaucratic precision. The wedges remain constant. The translations, though debated in details, achieve broad agreement on basic content. The divergence emerges in interpretation, in what those documented offerings meant and what they reveal about reality's nature. Perhaps the question of which interpretation is correct matters less than recognizing the human impulse to interpret, to find meaning in ancient evidence, to connect past mysteries with present understanding. The Sumerian texts serve as Rorschach test, revealing as much about contemporary interpreters as about ancient practitioners. The stars that Sumerian priests identified with certain Anunnaki still shine, still follow predictable courses, still provide navigation and calendar reference. Whether those celestial bodies are purely physical phenomena, divine manifestations, alien spacecraft, or archetypal symbols depends on the interpretive framework applied. The light remains unchanged, but the meaning shifts with the observer. The Mesopotamian relationship with celestial phenomena went far beyond casual observation, achieving mathematical precision that allowed prediction of planetary positions, lunar eclipses, and seasonal markers decades in advance. Temple architecture reflected this astronomical sophistication. The major sanctuary at Uruk oriented its primary axis toward the summer solstice sunrise, the longest day of the year when the sun reached its northernmost rising point. This wasn't approximate alignment but precise calculation. The temple entrance positioned so that on the solstice morning, first light would penetrate directly into the inner sanctum, illuminating the cult statue at the exact moment of solar rising. Similar patterns appear across Mesopotamian sacred sites. The ziggurat at Ur, built during the Ur III period around 2100 BCE, aligns its corners to cardinal directions with accuracy within 1 degree of true north. Achieving this precision required sophisticated surveying techniques and probably astronomical reference methods, measuring star positions at specific times to determine true north rather than magnetic north, which varies by location and shifts over time. The practical applications of this astronomical knowledge were numerous. Agricultural success depended on timing. Plant too early and late frosts killed crops. Plant too late and growing season proved insufficient for full maturation. The Mesopotamian calendar, based on lunar months but periodically adjusted to maintain synchronization with solar year, provided framework for agricultural planning. Priests tracked celestial cycles and announced optimal planting dates, their authority resting on demonstrated accuracy across generations. But the astronomical integration extended into religious practice in ways suggesting deeper significance than pure practicality. The offering schedules aligned with celestial events. New moon and full moon required special presentations. Certain deities received enhanced offerings when their associated celestial bodies achieved specific positions. The goddess Inanna, identified with Venus, received festival offerings timed to Venus's evening and morning star appearances, those periods when the planet shone brightest in western or eastern sky. This celestial coordination raises questions about how Sumerians understood the relationship between earthly rituals and cosmic phenomena. Was the timing purely commemorative, marking celestial events through ritual observance? Or did they believe offerings somehow influenced or maintained celestial order, that feeding gods ensured the stars continued their courses? The astronomical text known as Mul.apn, compiled around 1000 BCE, but preserving much older observations, catalogues over 60 celestial bodies, and describes their movements through the year. It lists rising times for stars and constellations, tracks planetary positions, calculates shadow lengths for solar timekeeping, and provides methods for predicting eclipse possibilities. The mathematical sophistication required to compile this information suggests centuries of careful observation and calculation. Some of these calculations achieve remarkable precision. Babylonian astronomers of the first millennium BCE could predict lunar eclipse timing within minutes, calculate planetary synodic periods with accuracy that matches modern measurements to several decimal places, and track precession of equinoxes, despite this phenomenon requiring observation over multiple centuries to detect. This wasn't casual stargazing but rigorous mathematical astronomy, comparable to achievements of later Greek and Islamic astronomers who built explicitly on Mesopotamian foundations. The base 60 mathematical system Mesopotamia developed proved particularly well suited for astronomical calculations. 60 divides evenly by many integers, making fractional calculations simpler than base 10 systems. This mathematical framework spread beyond Mesopotamia, adopted by cultures that recognized its utility. When modern clocks divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds, when angular degrees divide into 60 arc minutes and arc minutes into 60 arc seconds, we're using mathematical structure inherited from ancient Mesopotamia through Greece and medieval Islam. Alternative researchers note this astronomical sophistication and ask whether it implies external instruction. How did Stone Age societies develop such advanced mathematical astronomy? The conventional answer points to long accumulation. Start with simple observations, recognize patterns, refine predictions, pass knowledge through generations, build on predecessors' work. Over centuries, this process produces sophisticated results without requiring extraordinary explanations. But the counterargument notes specific anomalies. Some cuneiform texts contain astronomical data that seems too precise for available observational technology. References to planets invisible to naked eye appear in contexts suggesting actual observation rather than mathematical inference. The sudden emergence of advanced astronomical texts in early periods, before long observational traditions could have accumulated sufficient data, raises questions about knowledge sources. The temple as cosmic observatory makes sense under any interpretation, whether priests were maintaining traditions passed down from gods, from extraterrestrial visitors, from earlier advanced civilizations, or developing knowledge through their own observations. The architectural alignments and careful timing served astronomical purposes. The buildings oriented to celestial events, their platforms elevated for better viewing, their recording systems preserving observations across generations, the offering schedules timed to celestial phenomena, create interesting possibilities. If gods were identified with celestial bodies, feeding them when their planets appeared prominently might reflect belief in strengthened divine presence during those periods. Venus festivals coinciding with maximum brightness could indicate times when Inanna was most accessible, most powerful, most likely to respond favorably to petitions accompanied by generous offerings. Or perhaps the correlation runs the other direction. Maybe celestial events influenced agricultural and social cycles for practical reasons, and religious festivals clustered around those moments because that's when populations gathered, resources were available, and celebratory expenditure made economic sense. The religious calendar conformed to practical constraints rather than vice versa. The chemical and astronomical connections appear in some offerings. Certain metals were associated with specific celestial bodies: gold with the sun, silver with the moon, copper with Venus, iron with Mars. Offerings sometimes included metals corresponding to deities' planetary identifications, suggesting symbolic connections between earthly substances and cosmic forces. Whether these connections were understood literally, as mystical sympathies, or as conventional associations remains debatable. Modern archaeological astronomy, using computer programs to reconstruct ancient skies with precision, accounting for precession and other long-term changes, confirms many alignment claims while disproving others. Some supposed astronomical orientations prove coincidental, structures that happen to point towards celestial events without clear evidence of intentional design. Others show unmistakable precision that requires deliberate planning and sophisticated measurement techniques. The question of why Mesopotamians invested so heavily in astronomical knowledge has multiple answers. Practical benefits justified much: agricultural timing, flood prediction, calendar maintenance. But the integration of astronomy with religion, the identification of gods with celestial bodies, the timing of offerings to planetary positions, all suggest deeper investment. Perhaps they believed cosmic and terrestrial realms were fundamentally connected, that maintaining proper relationships with celestial deities ensured proper functioning of both spheres, the stars that Sumerian astronomers tracked, that they identified with divine beings requiring offerings, continue their courses unchanged by human attention or neglect. The mathematics they developed to predict those courses still functions, still allows calculation of celestial events thousands of years forward or backward. The knowledge they accumulated, pressed into clay tablets that survived empires' collapse, was passed to successor cultures and eventually reached us, connecting our understanding of celestial mechanics to observations made by priests who fed gods and watched the sky with equal devotion. Whether that devotion reflected literal belief in divine consumption, symbolic religious practice, knowledge received from extraordinary sources, or sophisticated integration of astronomy and agriculture, the evidence preserved in alignments and calculations and offering schedules demonstrates a civilization deeply committed to understanding cosmic patterns and maintaining what they believed was proper relationship between earthly actions and celestial order. The silence of space above, that patient emptiness punctuated by distant points of light, has witnessed countless human interpretations of its meaning. The Mesopotamian interpretation, preserved in temples aligned to solstices and tablets recording offerings timed to Venus risings, represents one of humanity's earliest sustained attempts to read cosmic messages and respond through earthly action. The tablets tell us what was offered but remain silent on the central question. Did the Sumerians believe their gods literally consumed the food presented before them? This gap in documentation may be the most revealing absence in the entire archive. The scribes who recorded every measure of grain, every vessel of beer, every cut of lamb, never felt compelled to explain the mechanism of divine consumption. They documented the transaction without describing the transfer. Either the answer seemed so obvious that explanation was unnecessary, or the question itself wouldn't have made sense within their conceptual framework. Modern minds want clarity on literal versus symbolic. We're trained to distinguish physical reality from metaphorical representation, to separate material processes from spiritual meanings, but Sumerian consciousness may not have divided experience along these lines. Perhaps for them, no clear boundary existed between what we'd call physical and spiritual domains. The statue was the god. The offerings were consumed. Both statements could be simultaneously true without requiring the kind of explanation we seek. Some scholars suggest the offerings underwent a transformation understood in terms foreign to modern categories. The food retained its material form, but lost something essential through divine contact, becoming depleted or emptied, even while visibly unchanged. This framework appears in other religious traditions. Hindu prasad, blessed by deities before human consumption. Eucharistic bread, transformed through consecration, while maintaining bread's appearance. Perhaps Sumerian practice operated through similar logic, where divine consumption occurred on a level imperceptible to physical observation. Others argue the system was sophisticated theatre, elaborate performance where participants understood the symbolic nature while maintaining the forms. The priests who redistributed offerings after presentation to statues knew the food hadn't disappeared, hadn't been physically eaten by stone or wooden figures, yet they continued the practice, because the performance itself served essential functions, reinforcing social hierarchies, legitimizing resource extraction, creating shared ritual experiences that bound communities together. But this interpretation assumes a modern cynicism that may not apply. Religious practitioners across cultures often maintain sincere belief while simultaneously recognizing symbolic dimensions. A Catholic priest can understand Eucharistic theology intellectually, while genuinely believing in transubstantiation. Buddhist monks perform elaborate rituals for deities while accepting philosophical positions that question God's ultimate reality. The human capacity to hold multiple levels of understanding simultaneously shouldn't be underestimated. The question of divine waste products highlights the documentation's silence on practical details. If gods consumed food through metabolic processes resembling human digestion, what happened to waste? The tablets never mention divine excretion, temple facilities for such purposes, or disposal of divine refuse. This absence suggests either the consumption worked through non-metabolic mechanisms, or that certain realities were considered too undignified for documentation, even while accepted in practice. Maybe the consumption involved only essence or energy, not material substance. This interpretation aligns with various mystical frameworks, where spiritual beings draw sustenance from emanations rather than physical matter. The carefully prepared foods would emit subtle energies during their peak freshness, and divine beings would absorb these emanations, leaving material components intact for later human consumption. The specificity of offerings would matter, because different foods produce different energetic signatures. We may never know if this interpretation reflects actual Sumerian belief, or if it's modern speculation imposed on ancient silence. The texts don't describe divine digestive systems, don't explain consumption mechanisms, don't address questions that modern readers find obvious. This silence might indicate the answers were self-evident within their culture, or it might suggest the questions themselves were inappropriate, based on category errors that wouldn't have occurred to Sumerian minds. The issue of belief intensity creates additional complexity. Did individual Sumerians vary in their literal acceptance of divine feeding? Were there skeptics who went through motions for social conformity, while privately doubting gods actually ate bread? The texts, produced by institutional authorities invested in maintaining systems, wouldn't document such skepticism, Even if it existed, we see only official positions, not private doubts or varied interpretations that might have circulated informally. The offering's massive scale raises practical questions that texts don't address. If major temple festivals involved slaughtering hundreds of animals and preparing thousands of loaves, and if divine portions were presented symbolically while the bulk fed human participants, was this redistribution part of original intention or a practical accommodation? Did the system evolve over time, starting with smaller offerings genuinely expected to disappear, then expanding into economic redistribution networks that retained religious vocabulary while serving primarily secular functions? Some mysteries may be preserved intentionally rather than accidentally. Religious systems often maintain deliberate ambiguities, areas where doctrine remains undefined to accommodate varied interpretations. The mechanism of divine consumption might have been one such area, where priests avoided precise explanation because specificity would have created theological problems. Better to maintain productive ambiguity than force clarity that might reveal contradictions. The question of whether gods needed feeding or merely appreciated it touches on divine power and vulnerability. If gods required sustenance to maintain their strength and attention, humans held leverage through the capacity to withhold offerings. But if offerings merely pleased gods who would continue existing regardless, human obligations rested on gratitude and proper relationship rather than mutual dependence. The texts don't clarify which framework operated, perhaps because both were true simultaneously in ways that don't translate to modern either-or logic. Archaeological evidence from other cultures provides comparative context but not definitive answers. Egyptian offering practices resemble Mesopotamian patterns in many details, yet Egyptian theology articulated different mechanisms for divine sustenance. Greek and Roman practices involved animal sacrifice with portions allocated to gods and humans according to specific protocols. Hindu puja continues to this day, offering foods to deities in temple contexts that parallel Sumerian practice while operating under explicitly articulated theological frameworks. These parallels suggest universal human tendencies, but each culture developed unique explanations for shared patterns. The possibility that we're asking wrong questions deserves consideration. Modern inquiries about literal versus symbolic, about consumption mechanisms and divine digestion, may impose alien categories on ancient experience. Perhaps Sumerian relationship with their gods operated through frameworks so different from contemporary thought that our questions miss the point entirely. Like asking whether dreams are real or imaginary, the question itself might be based on distinctions that don't apply to the phenomenon being investigated. What remains certain is uncertainty itself. The tablets document practices without explaining beliefs. The architecture preserves ritual spaces without revealing what occurred within them at levels beyond physical action. The mythology describes divine natures without addressing mundane details of how gods interacted with offerings. We're left with evidence that allows multiple interpretations, none completely satisfying, all plausible within limits. This uncertainty isn't failure of archaeology or scholarship, but honest confrontation with limits of knowledge recovery. Some information doesn't survive into artifacts and texts. Some aspects of ancient life were too obvious to document, too sacred to write down, too subtle to record in administrative archives. We work with fragments and make educated guesses, acknowledging that confidence should remain proportional to evidence. The stars that witnessed Sumerian priests carrying offerings into sanctums, that shone on temple courtyards where divine meals were prepared, maintain their silent courses. They saw what occurred but cannot testify. They watched belief expressed through action, but didn't record the thoughts behind those actions. They continue their patterns while human understanding remains incomplete. Perhaps necessarily so. The ancient mystery preserved not despite our investigations, but because of what those investigations reveal about the limits of certainty. The practice of feeding gods appears across ancient cultures with striking consistency, suggesting either universal human psychology, cultural diffusion from common source, or response to similar realities that multiple civilizations encountered independently. Ancient Egypt maintained elaborate daily offering rituals remarkably similar to Mesopotamian practices. Temple priests presented bread, beer, meat, vegetables, and fruits to cult statues twice daily, morning and evening, following schedules that paralleled Sumerian patterns. The offering tables, flat-topped stone platforms with raised edges carved with images of food, survive in museums worldwide. Hieroglyphic texts describe specific quantities and qualities required for different deities at different times, creating documentary records comparable to cuneiform administrative tablets. The Egyptian theological framework explicitly addressed divine consumption, the ka, a component of divine and human identity often translated as life force or double, was understood to consume the spiritual essence of offerings while leaving material components intact. This provided clear explanation for why offered foods retained physical form after presentation. The divine car extracted what it needed, but gross matter remained for priestly consumption. The theological sophistication suggests Egyptians thought deeply about mechanisms underlying ritual practice. Hindu puja ceremonies continue to this day in temples across India and Southeast Asia, maintaining practices possibly dating back thousands of years. Priests prepare elaborate food offerings called prasad, presenting them to Murti, deity images, through ritual protocols involving mantras, gestures, and precise timing. After offering, the food becomes blessed and is distributed to devotees who consume it as divine gift. The framework explicitly acknowledges that the deity tastes or touches the food spiritually, while physical substance remains for human consumption. Greek and Roman sacrifice followed different patterns but served similar functions. Animal sacrifice dominated their ritual practice, with specific portions allocated to gods through burning, while other cuts were distributed to human participants. The smoke rising from altar fires carried divine portions to Olympus, or wherever gods dwelled, while communities feasted on meat that otherwise would have been luxury food, affordable only to elites. The system combined religious devotion with practical protein distribution.